Hi! This is the second installment in my 3-part series in which I analyze pink films through the lens of inceldom, capitalism, and some other silly little concepts. If you haven't seen the first part, I'd recommend that you do, though I'll try my best to make this video work well on its own too. If you've already seen the first video, you can skip to this timestamp. For the rest of you, I'll be recapping a little now, so yippee. In the previous episode, we talked about Koji Wakamatsu's 1967 film Violated Angels, a very dark movie about a man who looks a bunch of student nurses because he's scared of sex and female agency. At the end of the movie, it's revealed that the only kind of femininity the man can accept is the motherly kind. A theme that's prevalent throughout the movie is that of Freud's Madonna Pearl complex, also known as psychic impotence. There's the theory that some men have a very binary view of women. It's not really a theory at this point. And this binary way of thinking causes them to view women as either a fully pure, virtuous, and nurturing figure, the Madonna, or as a promiscuous and manipulative one, the Pearl. Another one of the movie's themes is emasculation. The man in the movie struggles to adhere to the ideals of hegemonic masculinity, the traits and behaviors that society expects men to inhabit. For example, being dominant, emotionless, competitive, and most importantly, just not being feminine. Incels tend to feel like their performance of masculinity is inadequate, that they're lacking what they need in order to be a real man. French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan calls this phenomenon symbolic castration. This term comes from his idea of the phallus. This phallus is not a literal physical phallus necessarily. It's a signifier for the aforementioned lack. When you admit to yourself that you lack what you want, in this case to be a real man, you're symbolically castrated. This is shown explicitly in The Man in Violated Angels, as his gender dysphoria causes him to be terrified of being seen in a context. The only time he actually shows any skin in the movie is at the very end, when he's given up on pursuing masculine dominance, and instead lets himself be cared for by the movie's final girl, who employs a gentle, motherly attitude in order to subdue the man. That's a very condensed recap. Watch the original if it sounds interesting. Yeah. Before we get into this video, a quick Patreon plug. Because of the nature of the topic at hand, I'll be censoring myself a lot, not just when it comes to the visuals, but also my language. If you'd like to see the uncensored, unfiltered version of this video, head to Patreon. Also, second content warning here, as well as an explanation of what I'm actually trying to do with this series. Later in this video, there will be a whole chapter dedicated to discussing the ethics of a genre like pink films, and the paradoxical nature of trying to make feminist statements while also creating a product that literally uses women suffering at the hands of the patriarchy as a way to make money, primarily for male filmmakers and producers. But for now, I'll just say this. This paradox is of course a huge elephant in the room when it comes to discussing these movies, and it's totally fair if that makes you uncomfortable with engaging with this type of cinema. These movies are definitely not for everyone, and I don't doubt that I would have a very different perspective of these films if I were a woman. No matter how woke the subtext of these movies, they are still directly profiting and normalizing, in a sense, the abuse of women at the hands of men. I'm not here to glaze these movies or these filmmakers, though it is true that I'm a fan of these movies. I'm a fan of pink films. I'm choosing to talk about these movies because I find this paradox incredibly interesting. While Violated Angels contains some pretty grim and disturbing scenes and tackles very dark subjects, it's a relatively tame film compared to the rest of the stuff I'll be discussing. The abuse portrayed in these next movies will be a lot more intense, more frequent, and in worse taste. So, if you don't feel up for hearing about that, this is your warning. I won't be mad if you click off the video. All that said, let's get into episode 2. It's 1971. Nikkatsu, Japan's oldest major film production company, has decided to focus all their energy on producing higher budget pink films, which they refer to as Roman porno, short for romantic for genre. While it was already common for pink films to be marketed primarily as erotica, Nikkatsu's Roman porno took it to another level, both when it comes to the cover arts, which, again, Patreon version, but also with the titles. I'd like to read off some of my favorites here. We have Test Rider, Wet Highway, Japan Olympics, The Social Feast at Nipple Mountain, War, and Swedish porno, Forest of Beastly Desire. And yes, Nikkatsu made a whole series of Roman porno with Swedish actresses, and I feel very seen. Tack så mycket, Nikkatsu. Tack. It was actually very common for Nikkatsu to create a series of films with similar titles, like Swedish Porno, for example, that all focused on the same niche for the same kink. One example of such a series, other than the aforementioned Swedish Porno, is Apartment Wife, which has over 40 entries. And this strategy would soon be adopted by many other Japanese sexploitation studios, including Toei Company, and yes, that is that Toei, the One Piece one. Toei's Pink films were released under the brand of Pinky Violence, and just like the name would suggest, these films put a greater emphasis on violence and torture rather than just pure sexploitation. Nikkatsu 2 would follow that same path towards making darker, more controversial subject matter the focal points of their romance. This focus on violence, as opposed to pure erotica, might have been in response to the steadily growing hardcore JAV market, because why would someone who just wants to experience the novelty of sex on screen choose to watch less graphic simulated sex in a Pink film when it could just as easily go and buy or rent a JAV VHS tape and get the real thing? That decision between Pink films and JAV becomes less easy to make if you add an engaging narrative, gore, and art house cinematography into the mix. Pinky Violence made sure that Pink films wouldn't become just a more subdued version of JAV. The trend towards more violent, uncomfortable material coincided with movie theaters turning into an increasingly monosocial space. By this I mean that the cinema was becoming a total sausage fest. Pink films were taking up increasing amounts of space at cinemas throughout the 60s and 70s. By 1979, almost 80% of Japanese films released in cinemas were Pink films. Because of this, fewer and fewer women were interested in going to the cinema. Can't imagine why movies eroticizing queer would have a hard time attracting a female audience. As movie theaters became less and less popular and profitable due to women preferring to watch movies at home on TV, the sentiment that Japan was a feminized nation grew. This wasn't a new thing. The sense of national emasculation had been festering since Japan lost World War II, and had been represented in Pink films since the birth of the genre. Just look at Black Snow, the racist Pink film I mentioned in the last episode, the one that caused the forming of Eirin, Japan's censorship board. It's in the monosocial cinemas of 70s Japan that these feelings were getting really hot. Sausages are for grilling after all. The cinema had become a communal space for disenfranchised, frustrated, emasculated men where they could watch movies that reflected their increasing bitterness. This is not all too dissimilar to monosocial spaces on the internet, like incel forums, Discord servers, or 4chan's poll board, which, by the way, was created by Moot after a meeting with Jeffrey Knytt. And I'm not saying the poll was a psyop purposefully designed in order to increase alt-right sentiments on the internet. One big important difference between those online incel breeding grounds, which is an ironic sentence, and the Pink film cinemas of the late 70s and 80s is the fact that Pink films, though exploitative, violent, and misogynistic, were willing to criticize the hateful, misanthropic views that were so popular among their audience. I don't know who would be more well-suited to represent this era of increasingly edgy Pink films than the guy who's friends with the world's most notorious and cannibal murderer. Hisayasu Satō is possibly the most well-known and well-regarded director associated with Pink films, at least in the West. He's made over 50 movies over the course of 4 decades, and he's still going. He's one of the so-called 4 devils of Pink film, and some of his movies have even been officially released here in the West now as part of Vinegar Syndrome's Pink Line series. I've got one here. Satō represents Pinku at its most depraved, with most of his filmography consisting of horrific depictions of assault, gore, and perversion, but also at its most artsy and contemplative. Paranoia, depression, and loneliness plague Sato's tortured characters. His worlds are cold, isolating, and subtly surreal, with analog technology often taking center stage in both his sets and narratives. Sato's biography section won't be as long or detailed as Wakamatsu's though, mainly because there's not a lot of information about the man out there. I guess it does make sense that someone whose movies are so concerned with surveillance and voyeurism would be a pretty private person. What we do know is that he was born on August 15, 1945 in Shizuoka Prefecture. Or actually, maybe we don't know that. In an interview with Electric Sheep magazine, he said that that's when he was born, but other sources, such as the book Eros in Hell by Jack Hunter, state that he was born in 1959. I'm choosing to believe the interview though, because those are the man's own words. So let's say 1945. This was less than a month before Japan lost World War II, and Satō has described the political atmosphere of this post-war period, the late Showa era, as something he wants to capture in his work. As opposed to Wakamatsu, Satō doesn't aim to make the political systems themselves the targets of the anger expressed in his movies. Instead, what angers and frustrates him is the everyday violence of the individuals suppressed by said systems. Satō moved to Tokyo when he was 18 to attend Tokyo Polytechnic University, or Tokyo College of Industrial Arts. This is another case of sources differing. Whichever the case, while there, he felt a disconnect between himself and society. Around this time, he spent a lot of time watching movies and came to realize that pink films expressed the repressed anger he felt towards society more effectively than any other type of movie. This is when Satō decided that he wanted to be a filmmaker. After graduating, he started working at Shishi Production, a pink film company created by Hiroshi Mukai, one of Koji Wakamatsu's contemporaries. He worked as an assistant director at Shishi Production for a few years before finally being given the opportunity to direct his own movie. This film was released with the name Charge! Lolita Poaching, but I'll instead be using Hisayasu Satō's preferred title, The Infinitely Less Gross Distorted Sense of Touch. Distorted Sense of Touch has two main characters. Masao, a serial killer whose MO involves threatening his victims with a knife and taking photos while abusing them before wrapping them up in a furoshiki, a traditional Japanese wrapping cloth, and dumping them naked on the side of the road. He then puts the photos of the abuse up on the wall in his dingy, windowless apartment. The other main character is Mika, an 18-year-old high schooler with an incredibly unstable home life. She lives with her sister Eri, who's a sex worker, and an older, seemingly intellectually disabled man who's been restrained to a pole in the living room by his feet, making him unable to leave. I think he's been kidnapped by Eri, because at one point we see her the poor man, while seemingly unbothered by Mika being in the same room. Mika and Masao's stories merge pretty early on when Masao sees Mika shoplifting at a grocery store. She gets caught by the store owner, and for some reason Masao decides to help out by beating up the grocery store clerk. The next day, we see Masao leaving the screening room of a pink theater. He goes to the restroom to pee, but a man sneaks up on him with a knife and forces him to vomit in one of the stalls. At least he promises to pay him afterwards, as if that makes it any better. Masao manages to take the man's knife and wallet before shoving his head in a urinal and spitting on him. He leaves the restroom and finds Mika sitting on a bench outside the women's restroom where her sister is seeing a client. Here, the two start talking, bonding even, and soon form a strangely sweet relationship. Their dynamic is what makes this movie. Mika hates sex and anything to do with it, which is understandable given her circumstances. Because of the sex revulsion, she's a great foil to the sex-crazed maniac Masao. Masao has a very twisted view of femininity, obviously. In his mind, there is no Madonna, and all women are all women except Mika. Her innocent appearance and disinterest in sex means that she doesn't fit into Masao's idea of what a woman is, which in turn allows him to view her as an actual person rather than an object. I think the moment when Masao first realizes that Mika doesn't match his false idea of womanhood is when he attempts to feel her up while they're watching a pink film at the theater, but she stops him, saying that she's not like her sister. Mika resents Eri, but I don't think she hates her. It's just that Eri has become a symbol of sexuality for Mika. It's very likely that Eri's lifestyle is a root cause of Mika's hatred of sex. In a previous scene, she's even shown cutting up Eri's high heels with a pair of scissors. High heels have been associated with female sexuality for a long time, and Distorted Sense of Touch uses them in that same way. In particular, as a symbol of Mika's relation with her own sexuality and femininity. Masao has a whole arsenal of symbols. His knife is his phallus. Much like the gun in Violated Angels, it acts both as a symbol of power and as a symbol of his perceived lack of power. He uses various tools to abuse his victims throughout the movie, but the knife is the only constant other than the camera. While the camera is a tool of control, because seeing is a form of dominance, and each time an image of abuse is viewed, the victim is re-traumatized, it's also a symbol of Masao's mental state as a whole. Because of this, I think the knife is what more clearly represents his phallus, his masculinity. Masao and Mika follow Eri's client out of the theater and beat the shit out of him together. They then go on a little shopping date, using the money Masao stole from the man in the restroom to buy a new pair of high heels for Eri to replace the ones Mika broke. Maso pretends to take Mika's picture using his hands as a camera. As I said earlier, the camera is representative of Maso's inner conflict. While he uses it to abuse his victims, he also uses it in this scene to playfully fool around with someone he's obviously quite fond of. The scene ends with Maso kissing Mika before running away like an embarrassed kid. On his way home, he repeats the word slut over and over, attempting to convince himself that Mika too is just a whore like all the other women. But it's obvious that his heart isn't in it. His moping is interrupted when he sees his pregnant ex-lover waiting for him. He pulls out a knife and threatens to pop her like a balloon. It didn't take much for him to go back to being just the worst ever. He tries to pull her hair, but realizes that she's wearing a wig, which he finds incredibly funny for some reason. Maso runs away with the wig, which he's later seen wearing and will keep wearing for much of the rest of the movie. At the same time as this is happening, Mika is walking home from the Pink Theater once again, unaware that she's being followed by 3 men, one of which being the client that she and Maso beat up earlier. The men kidnap Mika, forcing her into their car. We then cut back to Maso, who too has kidnapped a new victim. He assaults her before dumping her on the side of the road like he usually does. In the next scene, Maso is wearing not just a wig, but also the last victim's pink fur coat and makeup. When we cut back to Mika, we're greeted with an insanely brutal and upsetting scene. As the men assault her, she bleeds, implying that she's a virgin. This scene stands out from the rest of the movie's scenes, not just because the victim this time is the movie's heroine. Though all these scenes are upsetting to watch, they usually end rather abruptly. What's most unique about this scene is that it lingers. The 3 men exit the room, leaving Mika alone. We see her break down as she looks at her blood, frantically laughing and sobbing. I think this choice to let the camera linger on the victim after the act is incredibly revealing in regards to what Satō wanted to say with this movie. It forces the audience to face the reality of what has just been shown. I've previously mentioned how pink films can act as Trojan horses, tricking their audiences into examining their own behaviors and morals, and this is a great example of that. Like, only a very specific type of person goes to a pink theater to watch an erotic movie called Charge Lolita Poaching. Keep in mind, this is before people knew to expect anything other than simple erotica from Sato's movies. Those who watched this when it came out were probably doing so to get their rocks off to a movie with a title that aligned with their fetishes. I am calling these people forcing that audience to watch as the titular Lolita breaks down after the act that they paid to see happen to her comes across to me as Satō saying, "Is this the kind of shit you're into? What the fuck is wrong with you?" Sex, I think, consists of 4 parts. Ignore the rest of the stuff on here. This is the important stuff. First we have foreplay. Then we have the act of sex itself, I don't know, can y'all see? Orgasm, and finally, post-nut clarity. These have very different emotions tied to them. These first 3 are all very happy. They increase in happiness as you go further, with the orgasm being the peak. But the post-nut clarity makes you sad. It's not a positive feeling, usually. Because of that, it makes sense that most erotic content focuses on the first 3 and kinda forgets about the post-nut clarity. Do you agree?
I wouldn't even just say happy.
You don't think sex makes you happy?
I think it's more than that. It's like a buildup of positive emotions, also like an embodied experience. So like you have the affect of like, not only are you, I guess, happy that it's happening, but you're also receiving physical sensations. Yeah. You're also receiving like anticipation, the physical and emotional excitement that you're kind of building up. I think is part of that, and I think we should talk about that as well. And that once you kind of reach the point of it where you're getting the maximum of like.
Kind of just also matches a narrative structure, a 3-act structure.
Yeah, that's the whole point of what I was of why I had drawn that for you, because I thought you should structure your video essays with that sort of idea in mind. Okay.
So the final part in the series is the orgasm.
It would be the shame and reflection.
That would be the 4th part. Which
I
is
think
why
all
we
of yours is shame and reflection.
That's true. So, as we now know, it's more complex than that. I don't have an eraser though, so the happy face remains. The happy face is now saying anticipation. You're building up until here where you reach the climax. That's why it's called a fucking climax. Most erotic and or media will focus either on the first 3 or maybe even just 2 and 3. By doing so, they submit themselves to the fantasy of sex and hide from the reality that it's part of a bigger picture. The fantasy isn't just dependent on the removal of the last act though. The ways that the 3 acts are depicted also tend to be pretty far removed from how they play out in real life. I think it's in eroticized depictions of non-consensual acts that the gap between the real and the fictional is at its widest. In part because there is an understanding that everyone involved in the production is consenting, a willing participant. I've looked through online discussions of non-consensual erotic fiction, as well as CNC roleplay, consensual non-consent, and I found that the most common reason that people are into this stuff seems to be control and power, which isn't too surprising. Most of these people also emphasize that the fact that it is just roleplay and that all parties are consenting is fundamental to their enjoyment of it. One Reddit user, who has deleted their account so I don't have to worry about anonymity, described their interest in CNC like this. The thing is that the sub is actually the one in control. They can make it stop at any time. They set the limits. A dom doesn't see their partner as an object. The reason I enjoy CNC is because it's exciting to know that at any time and almost anywhere, I can use my partner however I want, within her established boundaries, and knowing that she absolutely wants me to and is going to be just as turned on. This yearning for the sub or victim to be enjoying the act is actually pretty prevalent in erotica depicting assault too. One example of this is the netorara genre, in which a large part of the appeal is the fantasy of being so good at assaulting your victim that they decide to leave their partner to be with you. This isn't at all representative of all of these kinds of works, with a large chunk consisting of material centered specifically around the victim's lack of enjoyment. But even in these cases, there is an understanding that it's all simulated, and that the actors and actresses are willing participants. Though there is a conversation to be had about to what extent consent exists for female sex workers living in a capitalist patriarchal society. Whatever the case, I doubt that the majority of people who consume this kind of content would do so if they thought they were watching an actual assault. There are definitely pieces of shit who would be into that and do consume that kind of content, but I believe that they're very different from the average consumer of non-con fiction. The audience can be reassured of the fictional nature of the piece through various means. One is the acting itself. The actors or actresses portraying the victims in these scenarios often don't act in very realistic ways. Instead, they let out exaggerated, orgasmic moans because if they were screaming for help, attempting to defend themselves in a realistic manner, it would take the audience out of the fantasy and remind them too much of the very real, horrible thing. In Distorted Sense of Touch, Satō does the exact opposite of what you'd expect from an erotic film director. He frames the scene in the way that would take the viewer out of the fantasy as much as possible, while still giving them the scenario they came for, of course. That's the paradox of the genre I mentioned earlier. Fantasy versus reality is something Freud explored with his pleasure and reality principles. A very simplified explanation of these concepts is that the pleasure principle is managed by the id and drives us to seek immediate pleasure, while the reality principle, managed by the ego, develops as we grow more mature and teaches us to control ourselves. The struggle between id and ego, pleasure and reality, are at the center of Distorted Sense of Touch. Both protagonists struggle with holding back, with one obviously being much worse than the other morally. Mika's id just makes her shoplift and destroy her sister's shoes, while Maso's id drives him to kidnap and abuse women. When the two first meet, Maso is fully driven by his id already, while Mika, though she acts impulsively at times, is way more in control of herself, as can be seen in how steadfast she is in her celibacy. The more Maso and Mika spend time together, the more Mika begins to give in to her unhealthy urges. Like when she helps violently beat up her sister's client. This action is what directly leads to the assault she suffers later on. Like the movie is punishing her for succumbing to her id. I'm of course not in any way saying that she deserved what happened to her, but I think the movie is saying that reckless actions lead you to danger, whether those actions were justified or not. Because she gave in to her immediate desires, the very thing she was so protective of, her virginity, was stolen from her in a violent, traumatic manner. On the other hand, Masao learns to hold back through his interactions with Mika. Their interactions show that, at least to some degree, he is capable of empathy, despite all of his evil actions. While both of these characters are struggling against the constraints of hegemonic gender performance, the way this affects their relationship with their id and ego is kind of opposite. When Masao acts antisocially and enacts violence and abuse on his victims, that's him aligning himself with masculinity. After all, that's when he's using his phallus, his knife. In contrast, Mika's reckless behavior tends to be in rebellion against her womanhood, when she destroys the shoe, for example. This is because in a patriarchal society, such as the one we're living in, women aren't supposed to act in their own interest. They aren't supposed to have their own wants and needs, especially if those aren't in the service of a man. If you become a real man by abusing and assaulting using your phallus, you become a real woman through being abused, assaulted, and murdered. In Écrit, Lacan says that while men yearn for the phallus, women yearn to be the phallus. That is to say that in society, men are expected to have desires, while women are expected to be what men desire, while having none of their own. This idea can be seen in many facets of social existence, but one that I find particularly interesting because it relates to me is biphobia. Bisexuals are often accused of faking their sexuality and actually being monosexual, but the way they're suspected of swinging differs depending on their gender. Bisexual women are often accused of secretly being straight, while bisexual men are often accused of being secretly gay. Regardless of the person's gender, it's assumed that what they really want is to be with a man, or to be a man's phallus. And if you're non-binary, you're lucky if you're even half-assedly included in the conversation at the very end. Because only men are allowed to have desires, they are celebrated when they allow themselves to be swallowed by their id, as opposed to women, who are derided and looked down upon for exhibiting the same behavior. See the difference in connotation between the words playboy and slut. Once again, when Masao exhibits antisocial behavior, that's him getting closer to aligning himself with hegemonic ideals, whereas Mika's reckless behavior is part of her rebellion against the expectations the patriarchy has put upon her as a woman. We cut to Masao cross-dressing around town at night while on the prowl for his next victim, and soon he finds one. It's Eri, Mika's sister. He kidnaps her and brings her to his apartment, where he begins abusing her. But something is different this time. Masao is even more cruel than usual, using his knife to a greater extent. Perhaps this is because he knows about Mika's negative feelings toward her sister, maybe he thinks he's doing her a service somehow. It's also possible that his increased cruelty is just a result of him having fallen further into the abyss. He drags the knife across Eri's face and her nipples, he cuts up her underwear with it, stating that if she moves she'll get hurt. He also says that he'll pay her, so this is all fine, right? While he's probably doing this to mock her for being a sex worker, he's also repeating the same line that was used against him when he was victimized earlier in the movie. Eri attacks Masao and manages to take the knife from him, another reversal of when Masao was assaulted. While that scene ended with Masao getting the upper hand and getting out unscathed, the same can't be said for Eri. While attempting to regain control over the situation, Masao accidentally jams the knife in Eri's throat. He pulls it out, blood spewing onto his face, and at first he seems scared, panicked. He doesn't know what to do. But then he begins stabbing her again and again, over and over. He keeps going long after she's dead. When he's finally done, he's shaking and breathing heavily. Masao has now completed the last step of becoming a man, using your phallus to not only abuse and assault, but also kill. In the next scene, we see Masao walking over to Mika's house with Eri's body wrapped up in the furoshiki. The only one home is the older man. Masao unwraps the furoshiki, revealing the dead body inside, and the man freaks out. He's helpless, both because his movement is restrained by his literal restraints, but also because his disability stops him from calling for help. We didn't get a very brief scene of Masao handcuffed in his room, having his photo taken by Mika. These two scenes, the one of Masao at Mika's place and the one of Mika at Masao's place, are very confusing to me for two reasons. One, it hasn't been established that either of them knows where the other lives, and two, Mika doesn't know that Masao is a serial or that he killed her sister, and based on what we know about her, I don't think she'd be very chill with either of these two revelations, especially after what she just went through. Anyway, Mika returns home to find the older man out of his restraint smothering Eri's body. Mika falls to her knees. This is when she fully breaks, and who can blame her? She picks up one of the high heels from the floor and beats the older man to death with it. We then cut back to Masao once again, still in cuffs, with his knife in his hand. He stabs himself in the crotch, using his phallus to destroy his own phallus. A final attempt to stop himself from succumbing to his id, succumbing to the patriarchy. Or maybe it's more like a punishment for having already done so. We cut back to Mika, who is now using the shoe to masturbate. She licks the blood off the heel before biting into it and breaking it. One of the first things she did in the movie was breaking the shoe. When she did it that first time, it was a rejection of womanhood and gender norms. But this time, when it's combined with her sexually satisfying herself, I don't think she's rejecting the transition from girlhood to womanhood anymore. Instead, she's accepting the fact that she's growing up while not letting it control her. She's saying that even though she's a woman, she won't be the kind of woman society expects her to be. In the next scene, we see Mika standing in the middle of the street, wearing the red high heels. Blood runs down her leg as she mimes the gesture of taking a photo. The first time I saw this movie, I thought her expression in this scene looked defeated and empty, like the terrible things she went through took all of the life out of her. But now I see it a bit differently. I don't think she's dead inside, she's defiant and pissed off. She removes her shirt, revealing her naked chest to the camera, as well as to the non-acting passerby on the street. On its own, this could be seen as her simply putting on a show for the audience, giving the men what they want. But coupled with her angry expression, as well as her mimicking taking a photo of the audience, it instead feels like she's judging the viewer, telling them that she knows what they are and it's making her sick. She goes to a photo booth and tries to smile for the camera, but she can't. Then out of nowhere, Masao appears, not cross-dressing this time. We see the photo booth empty, save for a single high-heeled shoe. Then we cut to Masao walking down the street with the furoshiki over his shoulder, Mika most likely inside of it. Despite her defiance, the patriarchy still just sees her as another woman to abuse and throw away. Now that Mika has stopped being a girl and is instead a woman, Masao is able to kill her as easily as he did any of his other victims. As long as the system prevails, any and all women will suffer at the hands of men. Now that the play-by-play section of the analysis is done, it's time to address the elephant in the room, that being Masao's possible queerness.
There is how do I say, without being rude, a gay connotation.
Is Masao a closeted trans woman? Could transitioning have saved her? Or is the movie actually transphobic and attempting to tie queerness to depravity? I'd say neither is fully accurate. The most immediately obvious example of Masao's gender nonconformity is of course his cross-dressing. Like many serial killers and abusers, Masao likes to keep trophies, and his trophies of choice are symbols of womanhood. But he doesn't just collect these, he begins wearing them, and he seems to very much enjoy doing so. Him doing this could either be just him taunting his victims, but I think it goes deeper than that. I think he uses cross-dressing as a way to escape from the hegemonic ideals that are suffocating him. The moment near the end when he stabs himself in the dick is the most extreme instance of him doing this. Masao isn't a trans woman, but he does suffer from gender dysphoria. Men are supposed to be powerful, dominant, and unfeeling. They're supposed to be in control. Much like the nameless man in Violated Angels, what freaks Masao out more than anything is the feeling that he's not in control, when he's unable to embody that caricature of perfect masculinity. I think Masao genuinely likes Mika, but he's unable to deal with the fact that he feels these things for someone, which is why he chants slut, slut, slut like a mantra after they kiss. He's trying to force himself to be the man he's supposed to be. But that creature doesn't exist, not honestly anyway. Him choosing to commit his assaults using various vaguely phallic-shaped objects, like his knife or in one instance a tennis racket, is another instance of the symbolic castration I mentioned in the last part. But in this movie it results in Masao attempting to transform that into actual physical castration. He's unable to bring himself to use his penis as a sexual tool, what it was designed to be. Instead, it only acts as a symbol of cruelty. I think part of why Masao's admittedly half-assed attempt at becoming a good person fails is because he still believes in the phallus and his own lack. And it's his failure to understand that he doesn't need to have a phallus that causes his mental demise, as well as the literal demise of the one person he seems to actually care about. But if that's the case, what's the solution? How do you make a man whose world revolves around his malfunctioning phallus understand that it's fine if it's malfunctioning? Hisayasu Satō says, put something in his butt! The original title for The Secret Garden is this, which I will not under any circumstances let slip from my lips in a public forum. Also, real quick, I want to make it clear that this isn't the only thing Hisayasu Satō makes movies about, it's just that these two movies fit the topic of this video very well. Satō's filmography actually spans quite a wide array of kinks, fetishes, and sexualities, from gay pink films like The Fetist, which is one of his best, or Bondage Ecstasy, his take on Kafka's The Metamorphosis, to the self-explanatory horse, woman, and dog, and no, they didn't actually harm real animals, the sex is simulated like in all pink films. Like I did with the last movie, I'll be using Satō's preferred title, The Secret Garden, for the rest of this video. But what does this secret garden refer to? Well, it's an allusion to the Garden of Eden, with the two main characters, Ida and Kozue, representing Adam and Eve respectively, and Ida's photo studio slash evil dungeon being the garden itself, I guess. You can kind of view the movie as a sequel to Distorted Sense of Touch, too. The male lead, Ida, is kind of like an evolved or devolved version of Masao. A version that has fully given himself to his id, removing any potentially likable qualities that he may have had before. Even the way he abuses his victims is like a more practiced version of Masao's MO. Both of them utilize inanimate objects rather than their own genitals, just that unlike Masao, Ida has a singular object that he uses as a symbol for his malfunctioning manhood, a vibrator. Both abusers take photos of their victims, but while Masao simply taped Polaroids to his bedroom wall, Ida has an entire photo studio. While Masao would dump his victims on the side of the road, at least until he accidentally murdered one of them, Ida is a full-blown serial killer. The final way he degrades his victims is by forcing them to drink a poison that looks a whole lot like milk, and I don't think I need to explain what the milk symbolizes. The main difference in how these two predators conduct their abuse is in their choice of victims. Masao mainly targeted more mature-looking women, while Ida specifically goes for innocent-looking schoolgirls. Another side note, obviously all the actors involved are over 18. While Masao's hatred was aimed at the Freudian whore, Ida wants to destroy the sacred innocence that defines the way we tend to view girlhood, defiling the Madonna and forcibly turning her into the whore. This is where a female lead, Kozue, comes into play. From the moment we meet her, Kozue is shown to be all too used to older men being creepy towards her. From catcalling to unsolicited phone calls from horny strangers, she can't catch a fucking break, man. And I think that's one of the movie's main messages. It's about the way that older men sexualize and prey upon young teenage girls. Kozue first meets Ida while she's putting up missing person posters around town. He tells her that he's a detective and that maybe he could help find whoever this missing guy is. This lowers her guard enough that they schedule a meeting the next day. And after that meeting, the two stay in contact. They meet multiple times on this one rooftop overlooking the school and talk about Kozue's missing classmate, who turns out to be her boyfriend, Yasushi. During one of their meetings, Ida strikes. He chloroforms Kozue and brings her to the garden, or as Ida himself calls it, Studio Submarine. Quick side note, the set designs in Hisayasu Satō's movies are always amazing, and this movie is one of the best examples of this. I don't know how much of it I can show on YouTube, but Ida's studio is covered with huge black and white photos of his victims at the moments they died. It's an incredibly memorable visual, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. Kozue wakes up restrained in the studio submarine, and Ida starts undressing her. That's when he notices that she has her own vibrator hidden under her skirt. Seeing this, that Kozue has a libido of her own, ruins his idea of her as this innocent schoolgirl he assumed her to be. Her character is explicitly designed to break all the illusions that young girls are some kind of perfectly innocent being. These preconceptions are challenged from the get-go in many of the movie's early scenes, as we see her talking shit with her friends, dealing with her period, and even pleasuring herself. She doesn't fit into what society expects a young girl to be, but she's closer to what an actual teenager acts like. As soon as Ida realizes this, it's like his perception of Kozue completely shifts. He removes her restraints and tells her that he'll let her go if he can watch her use the vibrator, because she's a pervert too. She's immediately flipped from Madonna to whore in his eyes. Even though Kozue agrees to the ultimatum, Ida ends up abusing her, using her own vibrator, and doesn't let her go. But he doesn't kill her either. In fact, he promises to continue looking for Yasushi. It's while looking for Yasushi that Ida stumbles upon Kazumi, a girl who goes to Kozue's school. Kazumi has appeared a couple times before as part of a B-plot involving her poisoning the school's soup in order to kill her bullies. Good for her.
吉村学園の人？
そうだけど。
Off-screen, it's implied that Kazumi tells Ida something that makes him question why Kozue is looking for Yasushi. Back in the submarine, Ida asks Kozue about this while threatening her with some kind of acidic substance, possibly the milk he used on his previous victims. Kozue claims that Kazumi is lying and tells Ida to bring her to the studio and ask her himself. And that's what Ida does. He kidnaps Kazumi and ends up abusing and killing her with Kozue's help. In fact, Kozue seems quite enthusiastic throughout. During the very upsetting scene of Kazumi's assault and murder, it's revealed that the supposed lie that Kazumi told Ida was that Yasushi is dead. It's jarring how happy Kozue is to help abuse and murder her classmate. I see it as her acting out in denial of Yasushi's death, but I also think it reflects the way abuse victims sometimes end up helping or protecting their abuser as a way to survive. In polyvagal theory, a scientific framework developed by psychologist Stephen Porges, I think that's how it's pronounced, this is called appeasement, a defense mechanism that allows the victim to convince the assailant's nervous system that the victim is on their side. I do think that Kozue was also just angry that Kozumi was saying her boyfriend was dead. While taking photos of Kazumi's dead body, Ida tells us and Kozue his backstory. He's impotent and therefore sees himself as unable to satisfy a first-rate woman, but he doesn't see people like Kazumi or Kozue as first-rate women, and because of that, he thinks the vibrator is more appropriate for them anyway. Ida doesn't elaborate on how his rating system for women works, but based on the kind of women he picks as targets, it's most likely something to do with their perceived innocence or youth. After Kozue and Ida dispose of Kazumi's body, they talk some more about Yasushi, and it's revealed that he committed suicide. That's the thing Kazumi told him off-screen earlier. Kozue takes this unexpectedly well, simply saying,
そう。じゃあそうかもしれない。
She pulls a VHS tape out of her bag, and the tape shows Kozue and Yasushi being intimate with each other, with Yasushi using the vibrator on her. The word virgin covers the screen before being replaced with death. Then the tape ends with Yasushi holding the camera as he jumps off the roof. Apparently he did so out of shame after accidentally rupturing Kozue's hymen with the vibrator. Even Ida agrees that this was a pretty overdramatic reaction. Just as we think we've solved the mystery of Yasushi's disappearance, Kozue tells Ida that Yasushi was the one who gave her the tape. The same tape that supposedly shows his own Yasus, and then he ran away. So the Yasus was fake. After all, the movie doesn't give us a definitive answer, but Kozue having the tape wouldn't really make any sense at all if he really did believe himself while holding the camera. So I'm going with the theory that he's still out there alive somewhere. Maybe his death is symbolic. We have virgin and death on the screen. Maybe it's like he died, the virgin version of him died. This isn't in the script, it's just something I'm thinking right now. After this revelation, Kozue unexpectedly demands that Ida have sex with her, and she promises to cure his impotence. And she's successful. She does so by putting the vibrator in his butt. At this point, Kozue has fully gained Ida's trust, so much so that he allows her to leave, even letting her showcase the photos of Kozue's victims at an art exhibit, with her credited as the artist. After the exhibit, Kozue returns to the studio submarine, which turns out to not be an actual submarine, huge shocker, but instead a shipping container on a rooftop, which is slightly less glamorous. Ida and Kozue start having sex again when Kozue tells Ida to bring out the camera. Kozue puts on some lipstick, which Ida doesn't think looks good on her, but he kisses her anyway. It doesn't take long before he starts grunting and shaking. Kozue reveals that the lipstick was poisonous, but the poison doesn't affect her for some reason. On his deathbed, Ida asks Kozue why she's killing him, asking, "Didn't you want to be together?" To which Kozue responds,
いらないもん。これあるから。
The camera, set to automatically take a photo every couple of seconds, shoots Ida as he passes away, a fitting end for this disgusting, pathetic little man. Kozue then opens the doors to the shipping container and jumps off the roof, just like Yasushi. And also, just like Yasushi, she doesn't die. Instead, she gets up from the ground and walks away, leaving the vibrator on the ground. The movie ends with Kozue and her friends walking around town late at night. One of the friends starts singing a song that Kozue was shown singing in one of the movie's first scenes. This song is Canary, written by Yaso Saijo and composed by Tamezo Narita. Much like the song that was sung near the end of Violated Angels, this song is a children's song that dates back to the early 1900s. Canary tells the story of a canary that lost its ability to sing. At first, the speaker wants to abandon, kill, or punish the bird for failing to do what's expected of him. But in the final verse, they come to a different conclusion. It's a song about helping each other out and providing tools to help those in need. In the context of the movie, the song could mean a couple different things. The canary could be an allegory for the penis. This is the interpretation that first came to my mind. In that case, the vibrator is the ivory boat with golden oars that helps Ida regain the ability to pop a boner. But I don't really think this interpretation adds up. After all, Kozue does end up killing Ida in the end. That's not very helpful. Instead, I think the bird represents masculinity itself, or more specifically, the cultural perception of what it is to be a man. Feminist writer and professor Cynthia Enloe coined the term militarized masculinity to refer to the type of masculine archetype that we tend to see in military propaganda and the like. One that sustains the image of the hypermasculine soldier who is trained to follow orders, perpetuate physical violence, and sacrifice himself to protect his country and its families. Klaus Teweleit's idea of the soldier male is pretty similar to this. He describes the soldier male as one that is defined by his body's ability to dominate, a body poised to penetrate other bodies and mangle them in its embrace. The soldier male's ability to perform his gender is thus defined by his ability to physically dominate other men. Perpetuating the idea of the soldier male as the pinnacle of masculinity is of course a pretty useful strategy when you're trying to convince people to go to war, which is why so much military propaganda imagery consists of stoic soldiers standing up for their country. Bonus points if you call back to historical warrior imagery. The problem with the soldier male is the very thing that makes him so useful. The criteria for manliness is very well defined. This makes it easy for men to know what's expected of them, but it also makes it very easy for your sense of masculinity to be proven lesser. If masculinity is about penetrating the enemy, the biggest shame becomes being penetrated. It is now time for another history segment. Japan surrendered to the Allied forces on September 2nd, 1945, which in turn marked the beginning of the Allied occupation of Japan, led by the American General Douglas A. MacArthur. Thousands of American servicemen settled in Japan as MacArthur worked on reforming the country. Well, this reform was framed as a way to push social progress by lessening the power of rich landowners, creating more equality for women, and punishing war criminals. In reality, it was more of a pure showcase of power. The American servicemen saw themselves as superior to the Japanese, their ability to perform the role of the soldier male having been proven superior. And since they were the superior males, it only made sense for them to be granted access to the ultimate proof of power: sex. In just the first month after the occupation began, over 100 rape cases were officially reported. The rape of Japanese women by American occupiers would become a constant throughout the occupation. Japanese law enforcement didn't have the jurisdiction to process crimes committed by the occupiers, so the only thing they could do was to collect information and file reports to the occupation authorities, who were more than happy to turn a blind eye to the abuse. I want to make it clear that Japan was by no means innocent during World War II, from forcing women into sexual slavery to the horrific human experiments conducted at Unit 731. Imperial Japan was terrifyingly cruel and capable of and prone to the exact same kind of inhumane behavior as the Allied occupiers. This is because these nations were all following the same idea of masculinity, one that dominates through physical violence and brutality. But Japan's war crimes don't excuse the way Japan's citizens were treated by the occupiers. This utter helplessness in the face of the enemy invading your country, dismantling the military and committing rape en masse, resulted in the figurative death of the soldier male. Thankfully, MacArthur was already in the process of establishing an alternative. Before the occupation, Japan's economy was largely controlled by a handful of conglomerates called zaibatsu. I won't delve much deeper than that into historical Japanese economics or zaibatsu, but if you're curious, I recommend checking out an article by David A.C. Adicott called The Rise and Fall of the Zaibatsu, Japan's Industrial and Economic Modernization. Anyway, part of MacArthur's restoration plan was to break up these big conglomerates and transform Japan's economy into a free market capitalist system. Yay! MacArthur succeeded in this, and with the everyday man's newfound access to capital came a new way to perform masculinity, one not defined by physical prowess, but financial success. In practice, this capital-driven masculinity isn't all that different from the soldier male. It's still about status and dominance. Writer and journalist Ian Kajanja describes the mentality of capitalist masculinity perfectly in his essay Understanding Masculinity and the Narratives That Feed Young Men. He says, you want the nice house and nice cars and beautiful family because that's linked to status, and under capitalism, status is everything. For men, the system tells them that the key to gaining status is inherently found in their masculinity, their ability to subjugate and dominate. So we hold on to it, buying into the world late-stage capitalism creates, while ignoring how it is slowly killing us all. But working hard doesn't mean you'll become financially successful, and the market isn't even really free. Even if you fit into the mold of hegemonic masculinity, it doesn't matter. You can't just enlist in the military and kill people to become a high-value Chad anymore, though certain countries would like you to think so. The steps to becoming wealthy are way more abstract and luck-based. When faced with this dissonance between what they've been promised and the reality they find themselves in, some men retaliate by acting out in violent and or misogynistic ways. This is something that Rachel Kalish and Michael Kimmel refer to as aggrieved entitlement. I mentioned these two and the article I'm taking this from in the last part, but I'll reiterate. Michael Kimmel is a fucking piece of shit. He has a bunch of sexual harassment allegations against him, which is of course ironic considering the topics he writes about. But despite possibly being a horrific human being, he is one of the most prominent sociologists talking about masculinity and male violence. Yeah. Fuck that guy. What we see not only in The Secret Garden, but in the two other films we've looked at too, is a disenfranchised man acting out in violence because of his inability to get what society has told him that he deserves and therefore will receive. The violence then becomes the only way for him to achieve something close to the cultural idea of manliness. Allow me to repeat a quote from Rachel Kalish and Michael Kimmel that I said in the beginning of the last video. If young men who are surrounded by messages telling them that real men are strong, tough and violent, and that they do not back down to threats, then using lethal violence to prove one's masculinity is not only expected, it supports those very values. What I'm trying to say is that if the metaphorical canary loses its sense of identity when it gets penetrated, as opposed to penetrating, maybe we need to construct an identity that allows for both. That's what the ivory boat with golden oars is. But that's still not exactly what happens in the movie. Even after learning that his impotence can be cured by breaking away from the constraints of masculinity, Ida is still unable to fully let go of the ideas that caused that impotence. It's not enough to suggest a modification to the patriarchy. It must be torn down and replaced with something new, like a vibrator. In a review for this movie, Letterboxd user Fake Outrage, whose VK account is a goldmine for these kinds of movies, compares The Secret Garden to H.C. Andersen's The Nightingale. Like the Canary song sung in the movie, The Nightingale is about a bird. Specifically, it's about a bird who is really, really good at singing. Once the Chinese emperor learns about this, he immediately invites the bird to the palace, and the bird is happy to perform for the emperor. He does so, and everybody claps. That's until one day when the Emperor receives a package with an artificial nightingale in it, who is as good at singing as the real one. They make the OG nightingale do a duet with the robot one, but what they don't realize is that the real nightingale is into jazz and shit, and he can't stop himself from improvising. The people hate good music, so they chastise the bird for not keeping in time with the clanker, and make the fake bird sing solo instead. Seeing that the people are satisfied with the boring clone, the bird flies out the window, leaving the people offended at his lack of gratitude for being replaced. They cope themselves into believing that the fake bird is actually much better than the real deal. That is until the fake bird breaks. Immediately, everyone becomes like Sean Kingston, missing the beautiful bird and its beautiful song. Flash forward a couple of years, and the Emperor is now on his deathbed, and the one thing he yearns for is the real, in-the-flesh bird. The bird obliges, showing up to sing his little song for the Emperor one last time. The song is so good that Death himself goes, "My bad, the Emperor can live, I guess," rates it 5 stars on Rate Your Music, and dips. And everyone lived happily ever after. The Nightingale is about how we shouldn't take what we have for granted, and that we shouldn't try to distill something beautiful into a lesser, more easily mass-producible version of itself. In other words, Mikey Schulman should kill himself. It's easy to see the parallels between The Nightingale and The Secret Garden. Both are stories about attempting to replace something real with an artificial replica, but the results are very different, and I think it's interesting to discuss why. In The Nightingale, the product being replicated is music, artistry. The consumers are shown to not understand what makes the bird's artistic expression unique or valuable. They see the artificial bird as comparable to the real one, despite it only being able to replicate what the original bird could create. They even see this limitation as a feature, saying, with a real nightingale, one never knows what to expect, but with this artificial bird, everything goes according to plan. In The Nightingale, the replica is inferior to the real bird in basically every way except for its lack of free will. The real bird can choose to leave whenever it wants, but the artificial one will always sing on command. That is why the real bird wins in the end. In The Secret Garden, this isn't the case. Here, the product can be seen either as the literal manhood, the dick, or as manhood as a concept, masculinity. If we interpret the product as the penis, the replica might actually be more capable of performing masculinity than that real human being. It's able to penetrate without the risk of impotence. This is of course only true if we're sticking to the patriarchal idea of manliness, whether that's the soldier male, the capitalist, or some other archetype. What this tells us is that a man who abides by the cultural ideas of what a man should be is in fact a more limited version of himself than the plastic replica made in his image. Actually, isn't Ida too just a replica of what he's been told that men should be? There's a scene in the movie where Kozue asks Ida why he does what he does, and he responds that even his transgressions are paradoxically attempts at fitting into society. It's easy to see the vibrator as the replica, but it might actually be more representative of masculinity in its purest form, removed from its cultural restraints. Removed from the shame, from attempting to fit into a certain image, and removed from the endless hunt for power. Much like the Nightingale, Ida is an artist, a photographer. But he's become so caught up in trying to fit into his role as a man that even his art has become compromised. Instead of telling us anything about himself, it simply shows his ability to dominate and hurt women. It's hard not to see this as a sort of self-critique of Hisayasu Satō himself. He's an artist, but his art can't just be a representation of his own thoughts, it also has to satisfy the sexual urges of his customers, as well as the financial urges of his employers. Now, don't take this as an overly flattering simplification of this guy. I'm not saying that the sexual violence and exploitative nature of his films are purely a product of his hand being forced by the market. His later non-Pinku work is just as sexually demented. While I'm sure his filmmaking was in part shaped by the constraints of his genre, I think it's just as much shaped by his own interests and preferences. Satō and Wakamatsu's movies function both as critiques of the predatory nature of patriarchy, but also as erotica indulging in the exact same kind of predation. Isn't that kinda gross? Well, it's commendable that the men of the pink film industry were willing to look inward and criticize their own behaviors, regardless of what you think of those conclusions. It's inevitable that their analysis would have some blind spots. That's what happens when you're too close to the subject you're criticizing. I also have those blind spots. Even though I'm non-binary, I was raised and socialized as a male, and therefore have the same biases as these male directors. And that's worth acknowledging. In episode 1 of the series, I called Violated Angels a feminist piece, and in retrospect, this was probably not the best wording. Sorry about that, y'all. No matter how woke the politics of a pink film, they are still works of exploitation. I think it is this very duality that makes the genre so interesting, though. Like, how can one make movies that are explicit critiques of the abusive nature of patriarchy while also producing works that eroticize that same abuse? Like, why, if these are the themes you want to focus on and explore, would you choose to do that through this particular medium? You could argue that the nudity in Violated Angels isn't framed in an erotic way. The camera never lingers on the nurses' bodies, really, for the sake of titillating the audience. It only really does so when making us view the nurses through the eyes of the movie's antagonist. And even then, it mainly focuses on their faces rather than their bodies. That case cannot be made for the films of Hisayasu Satō, nor for the movies I'll be talking about in the next episode. I'm not saying this to argue that Violated Angels isn't sleazy, or that Wakamatsu and Masao Adachi, the writer of Violated Angels, using women's abused bodies as canvases for their ideas isn't problematic, especially considering how they treated up-and-coming female pink film director Sachi Hamano during the production of Adachi's Sex Play in 1961, on which she was assistant director. This is how Hamano describes the events. Sex Play was the first movie on which I was assistant director. There was a funny episode during the shooting. Because I'm a woman, I didn't have a place for myself. I couldn't sleep in the men's room, so I normally slept in the main actress's room. One night, I was sleeping in the corner of her room, and the main actor came in, and they started having sex in front of me. I asked them to stop because we had to start early in the morning and I really wanted to sleep. But they didn't. So I went up to Adachi's room and complained, but he told me off and said that it was my fault. I'm not sure what he meant. He said they're allowed to do it, they're free to do anything they like. I got upset and I told Adachi that if he thought it was my fault, I'd move to another studio, and I left the company that day. But we were in the middle of nowhere, it was past midnight, it took me 12 hours to walk back from the location to Wakamatsu Productions offices in Tokyo. I told Wakamatsu what had happened. I asked him, is it my fault? Wakamatsu said, whatever the reason, you're the assistant director and you left the location and that's your fault. So I was told off by him too. That's the reason I left Wakamatsu Production. People always say I came from Wakamatsu Production, but I only worked there for 6 months and I didn't really like it. It was a way of climbing up the ladder. But sometimes I still argue with male pink film directors, and they all know what happened with Wakamatsu Productions, so they always laugh. They say, you will never change. All of this to point out, I'm gonna hurry up because my camera is almost out of battery. All of this to say that the point of this series isn't to glaze these movies, and definitely not to glaze the directors as people, but instead to examine how they critique their own inherent misogyny, as well as the misogyny of their primary audience. While doing this from a male perspective can make for very interesting and valuable results, it's just as important to examine the other side of the equation. That's why in the next episode we'll start off by talking some more about Sachi Hamano.